Friends, welcome back to our channel. The world is in constant motion, and a lot has unfolded since our last video. Today we're delving into a critical situation that's been developing, a complex interplay of military actions, social unrest, and political maneuvering, and it demands our full attention. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Your support is incredibly valuable for us. It helps our content reach more people interested in this critical information. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. And most importantly, be sure to stick around until the end, as we'll be summing up everything with some very crucial conclusions. The period following World War II and the subsequent Cold War was turbulent, but the current situation in Russia, stemming from the Ukrainian conflict in Eastern Europe, is arguably more profound. The extensive losses sustained in the war have gone beyond mere statistics. They've become a deep-seated trauma within Russian society. Consequently, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin leadership are experiencing unprecedented backlash from within Russia, primarily from the mothers, wives, and sisters of the soldiers involved. This has created a severe socio-political crisis for the regime and the entire country. Initially, the narrative painted for these women was one of heroism in Ukraine. But as the conflict stretched on, news from their loved ones dwindled, and the contradictions in the official statements became increasingly blatant, leading to active dissent. Despite the Kremlin's rigorous censorship attempts, the calls to bring back our husbands, and we are tired of being good girls, became progressively louder. The mothers and wives of soldiers had become a substantial challenge to the Kremlin and its power structure. This social upheaval is arguably one of the most perilous developments for the Russian government, since opposition from soldiers' families within Russia has historically had grave and unforgettable consequences. In past conflicts, such as the Afghanistan invasion, mothers discovered their sons were being killed and maimed, while the state tried to conceal the terrible losses. Again, during the Chechen wars, mothers and wives organized their protests, even at times directly engaging in negotiations with the Kremlin. Now, in the Ukrainian war, with hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers sent to the front, and tens of thousands either missing or maimed, the Kremlin's claim of patriotic duty has lost its credibility with this demographic. Across Russia, groups of mothers and wives have grown into organized committees and coordination groups, a phenomenon reminiscent of the post-Soviet era's Mothers of Russian Soldiers movement, which was always considered one of the most significant sources of civil opposition by the Kremlin. Today, this movement is deeply impacting Putin's core support base, causing turmoil even within segments of the general populace that were previously aligned with the regime. The mothers and fathers of these soldiers have exhausted every avenue to receive information on their missing sons, but few answers have been given. In 2022, Russian mothers even sent letters to Vladimir Putin demanding accountability for their missing sons, detailing that their sons had received minimal training and had primarily dug trenches. This very letter served as a potent illustration of the true meaning of rebellion. Photos in the international media featured women carrying signs saying, "Where is my son?" and "Enough with the war," posing an immediate and very annoying image issue for Putin's administration. Riots and quiet protests are becoming more common, often taking different forms. One such incident saw a group of mothers in the Novosibirsk region gathering at the governor's office, holding hands and chanting. Despite the rapid spread of amateur videos of this event, police quickly stepped in, seizing the phones of those filming and detaining some protesters. In St. Petersburg, a different type of demonstration occurred where soldiers' wives organized a silent march, walking across the city square with images of their sons and husbands. Their silent expressions spoke volumes, though the police still tried to disrupt this march. The repeated query about why Putin is concealing the truth from actual mothers has become a central discussion point within Russian society since the broadcast scandal of the false mothers on television. Genuine Russian mothers, who insist on an end to the mobilization and a complete cessation of the conflict in Ukraine, have asserted that their pleas will continue until they reunite with their sons. However, despite all the signs, the Kremlin's leader, Vladimir Putin, has ignored these concerns and continued the war with full force. This ongoing conflict, which continues with no signs of slowing down, has not extinguished the hope of Russian mothers. Of course, the Russian state has tried to censor any information on any of this and suppress this public outcry. Press bans, creating a climate of terror, and threats are all at play. Again, the Kremlin resorted to intimidation and trickery to put out this rebellion. Several regional commanders summoned women and threatened them with accusations of revealing state secrets and treason. Sometimes, they attempted to mislead them with lies, asserting that their sons are already specially trained and currently serving, telling them not to worry. Yet when mothers respond with stories of their sons being silent for 5 months, with their cell phones disconnected, the facade crumbles. Tensions escalate, and reports indicate that police are stopping buses heading to Moscow from regional areas, forcing them back under the pretext of preventing illegal demonstrations. This is a common tactic to prevent women from organizing mass demonstrations in the capital. Nonetheless, determined groups sometimes resort to clandestine routes to reach Moscow. One of these groups managed to unfurl a banner near the Kremlin with the message, "We are tired of being good girls. We want to know where our husbands and sons are." Within 3 minutes, the police took down the banners and detained the women. Yet, not even this incident was reported by the Russian media, but it went viral on social media. An aspect of these women's protests revolves around "stop the massacre" rhetoric, not only seeking the return of their sons, but also demanding an end to the conflict because innocent lives are being lost. Some wives and mothers, now more informed about the situation in Ukraine, have acknowledged that Ukrainians are the ones being victimized, recognizing the war as pointless. But voicing such opinions opens one up to the accusation of treason within Russia. Nevertheless, during street interviews, anonymous women convey that they do not hold political views, instead, just expressing a longing for peace, not wanting their children to perish nor the Ukrainians. This contrasts sharply with the official propaganda that states they are fighting a holy war like World War II, eradicating Nazis. Women who have lost their husbands and sons now openly say they no longer believe in this narrative. To mitigate the growing dissent, the Kremlin has undertaken numerous propaganda maneuvers. For instance, Putin has often broadcast footage of meetings with soldiers' mothers, attempting to project an image that he is hearing their concerns. But it quickly became obvious that many of the women in these meetings were either from the FSB or Defense Ministry employees, having no connection with actual soldiers' mothers. The more these staged events were exposed, the more the level of anger rose among the actual mothers, who demanded to know why he was listening to fake mothers instead of them, and why their sons had disappeared. A group of Russian women, under an organization known as the Women's Union, conducted repeated protests in central Moscow. Police intervened with a heavy hand to scatter these protests, leading to many arrests. Yet even this harsh response did not put an end to the protests. The women continued to protest, emphasizing they were tired of playing the role of compliant women, and that they wanted their husbands to return to them and their children, not being forced to grow up without their fathers. This protest movement can be viewed as an extremely rare example of civil disobedience within Russia. Furthermore, in a society deeply influenced by the Soviet legacy, the rebellion of soldiers' mothers against the state carries strong symbolic weight. Individuals who had been silenced by the concept of sacrificing for their country have now seemingly become convinced that this war is not a defense of their homeland, but rather an act of meaningless destruction. But it appears the most recent protests were initiated because the Kremlin's current concerns directly clash with those of Russian mothers and soldiers' wives. Putin took the critical decision to repeat a mistake he made in 2022, announcing he was sending an additional 300,000 of his troops to the front line in the battle. This announcement came on the second anniversary of the initial mobilization in September of 2024, revealing much about Putin's stance on the situation. History often repeats itself, and the strength and conviction of women is a factor that should not be underestimated by any authority in any nation. It is likely these new troops will be inexperienced soldiers undergoing short-term training within Russia. Ivan Balf, the head of the training department of the Russian Armed Forces, did not specify when these 300,000 reservists had been trained, and there are serious doubts about this. Yet the Russian military leadership claims they were trained during 2024. Former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had established 9 reserve battalions to prepare contract soldiers to make up for Russia's losses in Ukraine by the end of 2023. According to Shoigu, 335,000 individuals signed up for volunteer service in 2023. The Russian Ministry of Defense has also confirmed that more than 300,000 soldiers have recently agreed to voluntary contracts to participate in the conflict in Ukraine, which the Kremlin and state media continue to refer to as a special military operation. While it remains unclear whether these individuals have received appropriate training or joined the war front willingly, this move underscores a major shift in Russia's military approach, and this reliance on volunteer soldiers rather than mass conscription is a telltale sign that the Kremlin's military structure is decaying. Ivan Balv, head of Combat Training Directorate of the Russian Armed Forces, claimed that the formation of the reserve regiments for the purpose had been successful, but it is questionable whether a professional army can be replaced by 300,000 reluctant but volunteer battalions. It appears that these regiments are mainly new recruits who are willing to serve for a specific period of time under contract, thus presenting an alternative to compulsory service. Put simply, these volunteer military elements may just increase the casualty numbers of the Russian military, given that they will not have enough training in warfare. Mobilization is a method for increasing troop numbers, but if the morale of this force is low or constantly questioned by mothers and wives, any military success will be extremely challenging to attain. Airplanes, artillery, and tanks are vital, but ultimately, wars are won on the backs of soldiers. Such a strong reaction from the families of these soldiers also damages the overall motivation of the Russian army. Despite the possibility of higher casualty rates, this volunteer force is becoming a crucial part of Russia's military strategy. It allows the Russian government to mobilize additional soldiers for the continuing war in Ukraine, all without having to resort to mass conscription, which is perceived as a politically sensitive decision. Voluntary service contracts usually come with specific stipulations regarding salary, benefits, and how long a soldier is committed to serve. The government's emphasis on these contracts indicates a general direction of the Russian military to strengthen its military ranks with people who are willing to fight for money, not due to mandatory service. And this can be seen as a factor that might set Russia up for a military disaster rather than success. Doubts remain whether these 300,000 soldiers heading to the war in Ukraine will really be doing so of their own accord. Even some of the Russian soldiers currently at the front are fighting without being able to answer the question, why are we here? The same exact question is being asked by the women who cannot reunite with their husbands and sons. And it also seems like the Russian economy will not be able to bear the cost of this for a prolonged period. While soldiers were suffering at the front in terms of salaries, equipment, and logistics, Russian officials were claiming everything was all right. As time went on, the number of those fleeing mobilization reached hundreds of thousands. The fate of those who could not or did not want to leave is being met with deaths and casualties coming from the front lines. Although official statements say casualties are low and the operation is going well, there are thousands of women across Russia asking, "Where is my son?" Many are assuming that young individuals who have not served before, those who were quickly trained and were barely taught how to dig trenches, were then buried under the debris, and there were a huge amount of casualties. Russian mothers are actively trying to locate their children by following every possible trace of them. Yet just as hope started to fade, an unforeseen event occurred. A project was launched to comfort these mothers. But this time, it wasn't the Russian regime that was involved. Instead, it was Ukraine. Now, we're going to delve into this project and see how it has damaged the reputation of the Kremlin regime, while also demonstrating how Ukrainians care more about the missing Russian soldiers than Putin. The Ukrainian effort to find missing Russian soldiers, known as I Want to Find, is providing families with information about Russian soldiers who have been either captured or killed. This is a sharp contrast to Moscow's "we don't care about your soldiers" attitude, making many women think that even the Ukrainians care more about their sons than they do. This has severely damaged the Kremlin's image because, in the eyes of the mothers, it is unthinkable that Ukraine, rather than their own government, would offer assistance. Some families are calling Ukrainian hotlines directly to inquire about the fate of their children. The fact that this communication is taking place presents a risk to Putin, with the public realizing that the declared enemy is giving more information and compassion to the families, reducing him to the position of a ruler who can no longer deceive mothers with payoffs. It poses a challenge to the Russian leadership's historical legitimacy. A distinct I Want to Find project, falling under the I Want to Live hotline that launched in September of 2022 by Ukrainian military intelligence to assist Russian soldiers to surrender, was formed to address queries from Russian families concerning missing soldiers. The primary goal of the project was to provide Russian and Belarusian soldiers with a way to voluntarily surrender as prisoners of war. Bohdan Okeno, the head of the Secretariat of the Coordination Center, has stated in an interview that over 50,000 applications have been submitted by Russians looking for missing servicemen through the I Want to Find Them project. This is indeed an astonishing number. Okeno suggests that these figures only represent those who are not afraid to contact Ukraine, and that the actual number of Russian soldiers missing in action may be much higher. Okeno has publicly criticized Russia's lack of effort to identify or find the missing servicemen. He also noted many of these soldiers were still out in the open in Ukrainian fields. Anna Kova, the Russian deputy defense minister, announced her ministry received 48,000 DNA test applications from family members of missing soldiers, attempting to gain information regarding them. During a roundtable discussion in the State Duma, Kova stated that the DNA data from relatives was collected and stored in a database, inadvertently revealing how many soldiers are missing in action. Andrei Kopolov, the chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, warned against releasing such figures and said this information was sensitive. These statements clearly showed how Ukraine and Russia were reacting to the issue. The Ukrainian side cared more about Russian soldiers than the Kremlin and made more of an effort to locate the missing soldiers. The Ukrainians were rewarded for their persistence, as since its launch in January of this year, the Ukrainian project Kochu 90, or I Want to Find, has helped find 588 missing Russian soldiers. Of the Russian soldiers that were found, 533 were found alive among the captured, while 100 were released to Russia as part of a prisoner exchange. Of those who lost their lives, 55 were identified, and the remains of 33 of them were handed over to Russia. Since the beginning of the year, the service has received 20,009 requests from the relatives of Russian servicemen. This is another record broken by the Ukrainian service I Want to Find. The information on the website, which states that the project was initiated by the Ukrainian POW Coordination Center, as an indication of Ukraine's commitment to the principles of international humanitarian law, reveals the truth. Russian authorities are not communicating with the soldiers' relatives properly, and no one was informing families about what had happened to Russian soldiers who had remained in Ukraine as occupiers and invaders. With this project, the Ukrainians have reversed the roles and raised the hopes of Russian families once again. To summarize, history is full of examples of military collapses and defeats in Russia being sped up by internal revolts or mass protests. Now, this mother's revolt could be the biggest threat that Putin has seen. While some analysts believe this is not a scenario that would lead to a full-blown revolution, they do believe that public dissatisfaction will increase, causing Putin to harden his security measures. Nevertheless, the reactions from wives and mothers of the tens of thousands of soldiers who have been killed or gone missing are by no means a spark that can simply be extinguished. It is crucial to remember that mothers possess immense moral authority, even in traditionally patriarchal societies like Russia. These women, motivated by a genuine emotional response and not by the regime's lies and propaganda, are pushing the regime into a corner and asking what political interests are at stake over the lives of their sons. This is why the regime is becoming more fearful, since even in the post-Soviet era, organizations such as the well-known Committee of Soldiers' Mothers were not considered illegal, but always met with great reservation from the state. From this point onward, there are really two potential paths for Russia in the coming period. Either the Kremlin will choose to suppress these women's movements through the use of harsh methods, risking an even bigger backlash, or it will choose to take a shocking step back and consider softening the war. Putin appears to be on the first path, but if the heavy losses on the ground in Ukraine continue, and the Russian economy gets even closer to collapse, then this revolt of the mothers could lead to major political upheaval in Moscow. Looking at the current picture, Putin is experimenting with new waves of mobilization, stating the message of, "Hold on tight, victory is near." Also adding to this, the message of 300,000 volunteer soldiers going to the front line. Even the term volunteer is objected to by the wives and mothers of the soldiers, stating that they are being forcibly recruited and are not volunteers at all. To what extent conscription in Russia is voluntary, and to what extent people are being forced to do it due to financial hardship and other pressures, is a huge question mark. War is formed by not just a duel of tanks and cannons, but also by the tears and rebellions of mothers. In short, the cry of soldiers' mothers and wives in Russia, "We are tired of being good girls," has become Putin's worst nightmare. They are saying, "Stop this war. Do not sacrifice our sons. We do not want your lies." Speaking the truth, the Kremlin doesn't want to hear. While the Putin regime may currently be surviving on its strong security apparatus and propaganda machine, each life lost at the front line is fueling the rebellion back home. It is precisely if Putin is unable to pay attention to this voice from within that Putinism's most devastating blow is likely to happen, with grave consequences. As the casualties increase and the war goes on, the concept of Russian mothers and wives could become the largest popular movement that shakes up Putin's power. This is our breakdown for today. Thank you for tuning in. Conclusion: before we wrap up, it's important to remember that history has repeatedly shown how powerful the collective will of the people, especially mothers, can be. This current situation in Russia is far from over, and we will continue to monitor these key events as they unfold. It is imperative that we remain vigilant, critically assess available information, and not be swayed by propaganda. Stay with us as we continue to cover the complex, ever-changing global landscape. Thank you all for watching.